Hey designers, it's Jason, and I'm back with some content to help you with your microenvironment project. Let's get to it. All right, so we talked about floor plans and elevations in class. So first thing to help you out with kind of laying out some of those elevations and those floor plans, I have Illustrator open here, and let me just hide my meeting controls. Um, I have Illustrator open here, and we talked about how you can use this to get dimensionally accurate floor plans. So first thing I need to do is go to Window, Workspace, and put myself in Essentials Classic. This will give me some extra information in this top toolbar up here, as well as migrate some of my windows and tools over to the side. You can also do View and rulers, show rulers, or Control R in Windows, Command R in Mac to bring up your rulers to help give you a guide here. Now, if you right click on these, you can set them to a variety of different coordinate systems. For the purposes here, I'm going to use points, that's fine, but you can also set it to inches or millimeters if you want things that are more dimensionally accurate, especially if you're doing some printing. But points is fine for me. And you can use some of these shape tools, right? We talked about pen tools in class, but for this exercise, for doing floor plans, I'm just going to use rectangles. And you can see when I put a shape in here, it gives me the width as well as the aspect ratio and height of some of our shapes. So we can change those dimensions here. If we get a proportion that we like, we can lock the proportion in order to scale and unlock to change again. And of course, you can assign different fill colors, different stroke weights, or weight colors as well. So that's all fine. For my project that I wanted to do the demonstration on, I was inspired by some of the architecture that we spoke about in class. So specifically the Bjarke Ingels example of this shipping container neighborhood or village. Shipping containers are great because we have a lot of them. They get decommissioned from shipping if there's damage or if they rust. So there's available shipping containers and boxes that we can use to make into different kinds of upcycled architectural structures. So I was inspired by this. I wanted to use some shipping containers in a small studio space or tiny home. And I saw some inspiration where two shipping containers were stacked over each other. So I wanted to create some kind of space that was like that. So I did a little bit of sketching here just to get some ideas down on paper, and you guys will do the same. So jumping back into Illustrator, I can set these to be, if not dimensionally accurate, I can at least lock the proportions to what a shipping container might actually be. So I know from doing a little research that usually they're 40 feet long. So to bring that into Illustrator, I can use simple mathematical equations. So I could take 40 for 40 feet, and then the asterisk for multiply, and then 12 for inches. And if I hit enter, it gives me 480 points. The points doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent in your coordinate system. I can do the same thing. I know from research that they're 8 feet wide, so I can go 8 feet, asterisk again for multiply, and then 12 for inches. And I have 96. So here we go. That is the correct aspect ratio or the correct proportions for a shipping container that I can then use in my floor plans, right? So I can carve this up however I want. If I hold Alt, I can just drag another one, right? Release, and I can rotate this as needed. And there we go. Floor plan with stacked shipping container. Very cool. All right. So I'm going to leave this here. I'm going to come back to it later. I'll jump into Sketchbook. and just show you guys that you can do the same exercise in Sketchbook. If you just want to hold Shift and use an imported grid, I'll make a new layer in here. I can hold Shift with pencil tool, and I can start, if I give myself a black, I can start creating floor plans just sketched, right? Go to my hard eraser, increase the amount that I'm erasing, and there we go. All right, so I can do the same thing in Sketchbook and keep things to a grid, right? So if I just import an image of a grid, which is what I've done here, and accidentally sketched on it, but you can keep that on a separate layer, have some new layers over it, and you can begin sketching your floor plan just in Sketchbook. This might be nice if you guys want to then, at some point down the road, hide your grid and then use airbrush or some other kind of markering or colors to stylistically treat your floor plan in a way that is a bit more artistic, a bit looser than what you might get in Illustrator. So two ways that you can do floor plans in different softwares and create some dimensionally accurate and scaled floor plans just using software. So to move forward from here, often the hardest thing when going into perspective sketching is to translate something that is 2D or orthographic into perspective. So I'm going to show you a few different ways that you could proceed with this project using some of the software tools that you might be familiar with. So if you have some CAD background, awesome. I can show you some ways to use CAD. If you don't, that's okay too. There's some handy tools in Illustrator. So jumping back into Illustrator, let's say, so for my shipping container home, right, my two stacks here, what I can do is I can use the 3D effect to turn something into a three-dimensional visualization, right? So I'm just going to switch this back around for now, just to show you how you might create this. So right now I have a white fill and black stroke. I actually want to switch that. So I'm going to swap that, make it a black fill, and I actually don't need a stroke on here. So I'm just going to go to no stroke weight there. So now I have black fill. I could change the color here. It's not super necessary, but I think the visual is a little bit better if I go down to like a mid-tone gray. So let's say this was the floor plan that you wanted. I have multiple objects in here. I'm going to highlight the two, and I'm just going to show you what happens if we go to Effect, 3D and Materials, and Extrude and Bevel. So it'll take a second to do some thinking. What it's going to do is it's going to take that shape that I have in there and convert it into a three-dimensional object. I can then rotate the viewport. And this looks a little trippy at first. And there's a reason for that. I've highlighted two objects, and what I'm doing with the viewport is I'm rotating each object about its own origin. So they're both spinning in space, and it looks a little disorienting. So I'm just going to backtrack a little bit to when I had it in my floor plan here. And the thing I'm going to do differently here is I'm going to group these two objects. So now that it's in a group, if I do that same tool, it's going to rotate the two of them about a shared coordinate system. So that floor plan will remain linked. So if you have overlapping shapes, this might be really handy for grouping everything together to treat it like it is in the same environment. So these two containers look like they might be next to each other, right? So I can rotate this into a useful position to use for an underlay. I don't know, maybe here. And there's some tools that show up in the toolbar over here. So if you remember, we used extrude. So by altering depth here, you can see what that does, right? So this is, again, related to the points in my original coordinate system. So let's see how this works. I know that some shipping containers are about 9.5 or 10 feet tall. So I know that 9.5 feet is 114 inches. So if I just do 114, that looks like it's about in proportion, right? It's a little bit taller than it was wide. So it remembers that coordinate system that we assigned to it before, if you remember earlier, 40 feet by 8 feet. Now we're 9.5 feet. That looks about right. I can also change the perspective with foreshortening down here. All right, this can get quite dramatic and make it look like there's some three-point perspective going on here, which looks a lot more realistic for the scale of something that might be a shipping container. All right, there's some different presets under custom rotation. So you can go back to like some presets for some different views. I like custom rotation just to be able to configure that the way that we want. So that's super helpful. What if you had, and I kind of ran into this with my stacked design. What if you had something that wasn't just a single volume? Like if I wanted one shipping container, one orientation, but the other shipping container on top of it, but at a different orientation. So let's try to go way back here. I'm going to Control Z all the way. And I'm going to ungroup. Okay. So now let's say I wanted this kind of cross shape. If they intersected at thirds, let's say it looks something like that. I'm going to join these two objects, and I can use the Pathfinder window if you guys remember that. So Pathfinder is really helpful for combining and subtracting different shapes and different sections. So I can actually combine these two going to the Unite tool. So now these shapes are combined, right? I don't have intersections in the paths. I have one shape. So I can highlight this, I can extrude it again, rotate it as needed, right? I can add perspective. The depth here, let's say I want 2 stories. So if one story was 114, then 2, doing some quick math, would be 228, right? So that would be 2 stories. And let me just rotate that and rotate about that axis. Okay. That looks all right. Let's increase the perspective. All right, very cool. So if I'm taking this into Sketchbook, what I could do is then divide this up by site or using perspective mode in Sketchbook. And I can just say, all right, this is where this is breaking on the first story. And I can track that across this way and then this way, right? Using the perspectives of the larger object to then divide up my my composition. So I can do that in Sketchbook and then keep what I need, right, as I'm sketching. So maybe I'll do that later and I can come back in here, grab a screenshot and bring that into the Sketchbook to use as an example of what you can keep in the top story versus the bottom story, all right? There's other things that you can do using this tool. If you had different designed objects, let's say a bottle or a medical device or something, Revolve might be really handy. You can do that tool as well for three-dimensional shapes. Or for some of you doing, let's say, a landscape or a park or a playground, the plane tool might be really helpful for just converting your floor plan into something that you can then rotate and skew. If you do that, you might want to really adjust the perspective, and this might give you something that you can then sketch in figures or structures and place it where the floor plan is mapped out to. You can imagine with some different groups and nested groups, this tool can become quite powerful for situating different rooms, different walls, again, different objects and spaces around a complex floor plan. So the possibilities are, I don't want to say endless, but there are a lot of possibilities in just using this tool, and it requires no CAD experience. So this can be very handy for some of you. For those of you that do have CAD experience, then it becomes a lot more straightforward to put in a three-dimensional object to use for an underlay just using CAD, right? So some of you might use dimensions in here to say, okay, well, I want this to be 114 by 96. Make the origin midpoint to center that sketch around in the front view, extrude that out to be 40 feet. I'll use the apostrophe symbol for that. I want it to go that way. All right, cool. Three-dimensional object for the first shipping container. Second shipping container, I'm going to make another sketch. I'm going to put it on that surface. Rotate to the top view. Looks like I have perspective mode on, so I'm going to exit out of the sketch, turn off perspective. Try this again. Now, I want to show you guys some use of equations, but also geometry relationships for some shorthand positioning and dimensioning. So I'm a big fan of flexible modeling. So you might get some features in here that you know you need, but maybe not all of the dimensions that you know you need. And using the viewport in SolidWorks to see how something's shaping up in perspective to understand how dynamic changing of proportions will affect your model or the visualization of your forms as it's coming to life, rather than a straight linear progression of, all right, one sketch fully dimensioned and add the feature, another sketch fully dimensioned, add the feature. That's more rigid, right? It's helpful, and maybe if you have all of that information, you can progress in that fashion. But often in industrial design, we don't have all that information, and not everything is constrained. We want to be able to dynamically control the shape of something as it's coming together. So if I put some relationships on these lines, I can create the thirds that I was talking about in my sketching process. So if I hold Control or Shift, I can grab all of these line segments and make them equal to each other. Now I've divided up that shape into thirds. I can do the same thing. One line going this way, another line going this way, and I can divide these up into thirds, right? Just by setting them equal. I'll give myself another box, and I may not want the horizontal and vertical relationships on here in case I wanted to change the angle of the shipping container. Let's say I may not want it to be 90 degrees. So what I can do is I can make these line segments coincident to the box that I have in here. I can grab this line and make it equal in length to that line. I can grab this, well, either one. This one's already straight, so I'll grab this and make it equal. All right, so now they're equal in length. What I need to do now is just set them to be perpendicular to each other. All right, so that's perpendicular, that is perpendicular, and that will be perpendicular. Okay. I can set these to be midpoints. So as I'm selecting points and line segments, all these things, I'm holding Control to just grab multiple items. So this point in this line segment, I've held control. I can set it to be midpoint and look at that. Now it's a third of one container, a third of another container. They share that common point. These have horizontal relationships, so I can delete these. And once I've deleted all horizontal and vertical relationships, I should be able to, well, need to make this collinear. Okay. I should be able to swing this around. Now I have a dynamically changing angle of these two, but I've set them all to equal. So I only have one set of driving dimensions, and that's in the first sketch, the first object. I hit check, and I can make another 9.5 foot, 9.5 feet container above the first. Great. So again, this by default is in isometric because it's SolidWorks. If I go to my view settings, I can induce perspective. So it has some foreshortening. But SolidWorks isn't great about having multiple layers of um, or an infinitely dynamic viewport system for controlling perspective. It really just has three stages. So the first one is the most conservative. Um, SolidWorks is built for typically working with small objects, so it has kind of a less foreshortening by default. So if I go to View, Modify, Perspective, I can change that observer position. So from 3 as default, I can go down to 2 and then go down to 1. And you might see that my perspective or my focal length is made more dramatic by doing that. So I can rotate this around to some different positions to use this as an underlay for sketching in perspective. All right, so this might be pretty helpful. I mentioned earlier, we might want things to be dynamic. So if I go back in here and I go to the sketch, I can just pull this around and see what this looks like. Zoop. I'm dynamically changing the angle just using geometry relationships. All right. Pretty neat. Okay, so like I said, this might get you to where you need to go, but let's say you're not getting the type of dramatic environment that you really want out of SolidWorks. So I can X out of this. Let me go into KeyShot. And I can import my model into KeyShot instead and use some of the camera settings in KeyShot to get a more dramatic perspective. So if I go import model and my container home file, I now can use KeyShot and its camera settings to induce more or less foreshortening in my model and get a more dramatic and realistic underlay position for my sketching or for my rendering, whatever it is that I intend to make. So I do that by going to camera. Perspective mode is on. And you can change the perspective or focal length here in this setting. So this is the setting that you want to find. Counterintuitively, the higher number means that there's less perspective shift. The lower number induces more perspective. This becomes more dramatic, more foreshortening. Hopefully you guys can see that. All right, I'm going to toggle on performance mode really quick because I want to show you the interior of this. So this takes out all of the shadows that I had in my environment. So for some of you who want to do an interior microenvironment, then this becomes really handy, right? You get the kind of perspective lines of the walls in there if you just shell your model in SolidWorks. There's also materials in Keyshot that you can put in a wireframe if you want to, that will give you kind of the walls and the grid that you might need for your project. Right? So I just wanted to show you guys that in Keyshot. All right, so discard that. Okay, so why do we care? What do we do now? So I closed Keyshot just so my computer won't explode. I have Illustrator here, right? So you might save out one of those visualizations, right, or those screenshots. Just click off of that and you can take a screenshot of what it is that you see in your viewport. Um, I want to take you into Sketchbook because that's going to be the final stage of this project and this assignment. So what we've used that other software for, again, is just to give ourselves an underlay in perspective. So I'm going to close out that folder. Let's say I imported this model here, right? I can vary the opacity of that screenshot to begin sketching over on new layers in Sketchbook. So what you want to do at this stage is rough in your environment. So that might be doodling, it might be using airbrush or marker, or I have pencil on right now. Whatever you prefer to just kind of sketch out loosely and do the designing of your environment. One more tool that you can use at this stage is perspective mode. So we spoke about this a little bit in the first project. I think this type of sketching is really where perspective mode comes into its own if you're doing anything with architecture or grids. So I can find perspective mode up in my toolbar here. I turn it on, and we have different controls for 1 point, 2 point, or multi-point perspective. So mostly what we care about is 2 point perspective that gives us a realistic enough sense of our composition without overcomplicating things. Because most of what we deal with is at the horizon and in kind of realistic small interiors kinds of spaces. So rooms, maybe small buildings, but certainly objects within an interior where 2 point perspective is just fine. So what you'll want to do, I guess, before turning on perspective mode is on a new layer, you can use ruler, so R on the keyboard, and you'll want to see where your vanishing points might be in your composition. So I might take this out, sketch one in, and I'll use this object just because I know this object is in a Cartesian coordinate system. If you remember, this one at the bottom is at a different angle. So I'm just going to use this one object and see if my vanishing points converge within my canvas. And that's a big if, as you guys will see. Okay. So you can see that my vanishing point on the left side is converging, but not quite converged. So I need more space on the left side of my canvas, and I need a lot more space on the right side of my canvas. So what I can do for the purposes of this exercise is go to Image, Canvas Size. I'm going to pick the right side here because I want to push out a little bit to the left. So I'll go 3500, push out to the left. Okay, that should be enough space. Image, canvas size, push out to the right side. And I'm going to give myself a lot more space here. There we go. I don't know how much space I'll actually need. All right, so I'll go back to this layer and I'll try this exercise again. Ooh, close. But I think we can work with that. I'll do this other side here. And I'll give myself a little star or marking where my vanishing points are coming together. I'm actually going to push this out just a little bit more so I can put that point exactly where it needs to go. Push out to the left. I don't need much more, so 200 extra pixels should be just fine. There we go. I've mapped my vanishing points. Now I can get accurate perspective mode on here. So I'm going to leave this layer on here. I'm just going to call this VPs for vanishing points, and then a new layer, and then we can start sketching in perspective mode. So I'll zoom in, assign that vanishing point over that intersection point, and the other one, drag it over here. All right, once I get that situated, I can lock my perspective mode, and you'll notice that my cursor changes, right? So in two-point perspective, if you remember back to Rapid Viz, we have vertical lines. And then any diagonal lines that represents the horizontals go to my two vanishing points, right? So I can do this, and I can do this. Very cool. So you can use this for pretty easy sketching in of doorways, windows, stairs, architectural features, right? Lots of different things that you may want in perspective. So for multi-story objects or interiors, this becomes really handy for putting in the architectural features or the hardscaping of your environment and keeping it in a Cartesian coordinate system. You can easily turn off perspective mode. Well, you can hide your horizon line for sure, which may or may not be helpful for some of you, but you could also toggle off the perspective mode in order to, put in, figures or other things that are in the three-dimensional space that might not be tied to your perspective mode. Okay, so foliage, figures, furniture, designed objects, signage, right? Things that might not be linked to the environment. Okay. So lastly, you will do this for this project anyway. You will do this for setting up a draft of your environment that we'll then review together before we do textures and materials and final composition. So as you might imagine, there's a lot of designing you would need to do that you can use the perspective mode for, but by using an underlay that's derived from Illustrator or SolidWorks or another CAD program, that ensures that everything is in a united coordinate system. So I hope this has been helpful, and stay tuned for more videos. Thanks.